Jay's going to talk about JFK because I spent way too much time talking about all of these movies and stuff.
We talked about food. It's important. We gave pretty good coverage to the movies.
Yeah, and I don't want to go back in anyway. It's so hot in there.
What they deserve.
It's hot out here. I almost want to put the fan on us out here.
I almost feel like whipping my shirt off, but you lose all your audience.
Yeah, my audience of 2 people.
Yeah. So I've been threatening to deal with these books. I've got more of them. So this book, JFK on the Unspeakable. Yeah, this one has E. Howard Hunt's confession to his son, being involved in the assassination. So I finished this in 2017. 12th of July, almost exactly 6 years ago, a little bit more. 6 years ago, but I haven't gotten around to reviewing it. But yeah, I mean, one of E. Howard Hunt's sons claimed that his father, I believe almost on his deathbed or on his deathbed, confessed to being involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy. There's some skepticism about that. I mean, it is hearsay. Well, this one I finished the same day, 12th of July, 2017. Contract on America, not with America. I used to joke about Newt Gingrich's Contract with America, that it should have been called Contract on America. I didn't realize that someone had actually come up with the title Contract on America before I did, because Newt Gingrich, I think, was from the 90s. And this book was published in cloth in 1988, in the paper version I've got here in 1989. And the Contract on America, the Mafia Murder of President John F. Kennedy. Then this one, JFK, Autopsie d'un crime d'État, autopsy of a crime of state, a state crime. And there's all sorts of people in this French version. But this French interpretation or misinterpretation of what happened to JFK. LBJ is responsible. It's like a coup. From what I can tell, this dude thinks the CIA is heavily involved. Yeah. When did I finish this one? Maybe 2018. So about a year after these other ones. So it's been a little while. I've forgotten a few of the things in it. Got some pretty good pictures. Some of them are a little bit hard to make out, but grainy. They weren't intended for publication. And then the main one that I'm reviewing is The Ultimate Sacrifice. I've touched on it before. John and Robert Kennedy, the plan for a coup in Cuba and the murder of JFK. And this one I just finished up a day ago, although most of it I would have finished up quite a long time ago. But I finished up basically reading the index. And notes I haven't even written down when I finished it up. I'm pretty sure I finished it up. Yeah, I just never got down to writing out. So I'll have to say that I finished it up today. So this one's fascinating because the main source, or one of the main sources, a guy called Williams or something like that, claims that Kennedy had a plan set to go into action maybe December of 1963, just a few days, literally, a few weeks after his death. Of course, he wasn't planning on his death. And they kind of pussyfoot around as to who was going to be on the working end of the action in Cuba. It was going to be basically, what do they call it? executive action. It would involve killing Fidel Castro and replacing him with someone, and they kind of pussyfoot around as to who it is. It doesn't take as Don Cherry might say, a brain scientist or a rocket surgeon to figure out who that person was. It was Che Guevara. And Che and Fidel, by that point in time, 1963, weren't getting along very well. Had different agendas. And if that coup had worked out, it might have worked out for the whole world, not just the United States or Kennedy, much better than it has worked out. Because traditionally, foreigners don't do that well as tyrants, or at least relatively traditional. I'll give you an example. The British monarchs, English monarchs basically, have been foreigners ever since 1066 AD. 1066 AD. So originally they were Vikings. The conqueror was a Norseman. They call him Norman, but in the northern part of France. And the Norsemen, Vikings, conquered the northern part of France in, I believe, 911 AD. I think it was a guy called Rollo who led the venture. 150 years or so later, one of his presumably descendants, William the Conqueror, conquered England. Foreigner. Then his descendants and stuff like that kind of morphed into a French dynasty. And that, lasted a long time. Or it would be kind of various dynasties. They had the War of the Roses, where it was going back and forth between the whites and the red, the roses. And so, Richard III was on one side. The Henrys, the last Henrys, and then Henry VI were on the other side, fourth and sixth, I think, were the House of Lancaster. It's a different dynasty. But finally, there was the Tudor dynasty. Tudor is a mispronunciation of Theodore. It means the gift of God. It's a Greek word. Why is it so different? Because the Tudor dynasty was Welsh. Now, I guess they were popular enough, and it was Queen Elizabeth. She didn't have any offspring, as far as the Queen was. It's
the first one.
Queen Elizabeth first, thank you. Because some people are, people who think that novels reflect reality.
The awesome one.
What was that?
The awesome one.
Queen Elizabeth I. She was a successful ruler. Her father, Henry VIII, started to build up the British Navy, and then she was able to use it to fight off the most powerful country probably in the world, Spain. And that was the beginning, the beginning of the end for Spain was the aristocracy, was the autocracy and stuff like that. But that's when it started to really go under. The Armada got taken out by British weather and the English Navy. So yeah, she was awesome. I get the impression she really, unlike her dad, wasn't really that enthused about fighting. Some of the most effective monarchs in history have been, like women, but not necessarily totally pacific, but a little bit more sensible, a little bit less testosterone loaded when it came to dealing with war. And I'm thinking of Hatshepsut in the New Kingdom in Egypt. She was succeeded by the person she acted as a regent for, I guess, would be her stepson or something like that. Thutmose III. He was a big conqueror, but he inherited a land that was, from what I can tell, well off and all that sort of stuff. So She seemed to have been a good administrator. The other pharaohs, the campaigns that they put on walls and stuff like that were military campaigns. Her big campaign was a trading expedition to a place called Punt. I think it was Africa. I think there are other alternatives. One possibly even as far afield as India. She actually visited this Punt. I think it was probably Africa, but one person conjectured it was actually Sheba or Saba on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula. So from all accounts, she was a successful monarch and presumably relatively pacific. So there's Queen Elizabeth, and then there's Catherine, the so-called Great. I think she was probably pretty great. She did have the wars that she fought, but I don't think she was as wild and crazy as some monarchs that have ruled over Russia, including the stupid chimp that's ruling over it, squatting on it, and trying to squat on more territory right now. There have been unsuccessful queens, but the last queen of pretty well the last ruler of the 19th dynasty in Egypt, the 19th dynasty ended with her, and it ended with a whimper, not with a bang. With Queen Elizabeth, she left a state that was, it didn't end with a whimper or with a bang, but it was taken over by Scottish rulers. So James I, who succeeded her, was actually James VI of Scotland. And that's when English people got sick and tired of foreign kings. So they got rid of, I think they killed James I's son, Charles I. They beheaded him, and they had a revolution. It didn't work out. Like so many revolutions before it, there were actually revolutions before the English Revolution. That's the first one, really, in modern times. But the ancient Greeks had revolutions. They got rid, almost all of them got rid of their kings, at least as ruling entities, as opposed to constitutional monarchs. Sometime after the Doric invasion, they got rid of them again. The Doric people were foreigners. And I think that contributed maybe to Greeks getting sick of kings. But, like not all the rulers over Egypt after the Doric invasion were Doric people. They were Greek people from the northern part of Greece. Barbarian Greeks. That's not too much of an oxymoron. So Athens got rid of its ruling king. It kept a king as kind of like a functionary, handled kind of like, how the queen launches ships and stuff like that.
Sure.
He'd do sacrifices and so on and so forth. But he was one of, I think, 8 or 9 other officials. They called them archons, or you might mispronounce it, archons. Of course, when I say archons, I'm mispronouncing it too, but I'm trying. And but what happened it didn't happen in Athens. It was recognized that generally what happened after a revolution is you have tyrants. You wouldn't have a democracy. People might have been striving for it, but they ended up with tyrants. That happened in Athens. There was a tyrant, and his sons tried to succeed him. It didn't work out, and democracy kind of semi-developed, things like that. So that's what happened in England. He had a tyrant called Cromwell, and it didn't work out so well for his son. And so there was a restoration. They brought the kings back in, and still the stewards. The steward is Rod Stewart, comes from Scottish ancestry. It means steward, someone who serves. And this was in 1660, but 29 years later, there was what's called a glorious revolution, and it was one of the most glorious revolutions in the world. I can only think of 2. The other was the American Revolution. Every other one since then has been a miserable failure. Starting with the French Revolution. Disgusting. shouldn't have to say anything about the Russian Revolution. I guess you'd call it something like a Chinese Revolution. Mao Zedong, absolutely disgusting. Every little revolution or so-called decolonization of Africa and other places in the so-called third world.
South America.
South America, they actually had their revolutions kind of like during the Napoleonic War, because Napoleon stomped into Spain, and the people in South America, they've been squatted on by the Spaniards, and they're saying, "Okay, dudes, you're fighting off Napoleon. You're going to fight us? You know, you wouldn't want army because you're."
Was that Napoleon the First?
Napoleon the First, exactly right. So that's where the English helped set up sort of like Napoleon's Vietnam. They were like, Spain is pretty rough territory. It's not heavily forested, I don't think, even back then. But they were fighting guerrilla stuff. It probably would have been terror most of the time when guerrilla activities taking place in the world, and this includes now, folks. It's just more or less out and out terrorism. But it would be just they'd attack and then retreat. The Napoleonic troops they just be losing people. It's a little bit like Afghanistan, only not as rough, stuff like that. So. A fascinating little thing. What was the name? It wasn't Nelson, but what was the name? Wellington or something like that. Still trying to wake up, but he helped coordinate that for the Brits, and so yeah, that's what happened. I think it happened. When did it happen with Haiti? I think it was during the Napoleonic War. You see, the French lost a lot of land during the Napoleonic War. I think that's when the Americans made the Louisiana Purchase. Louisiana is named after Louis, King Louis. St. Louis is named after, I think, they actually had a king that's they considered a saint, San Louis. Can't remember the number, but so. The Americans bought basically most of the land all the way from Louisiana way up to Washington, as I recall, the purchase, and it would be Ohio and all that sort of stuff. That was French land. So a huge hunk of the American, what we consider the United States nowadays, was bought, I think, somewhere around 1804 or something like that. So, that's during the Napoleonic Wars, and I figure Napoleon did that to kind of finance his wars in Europe and stuff like that. He ended up losing just a hunk of land, and of course he ended up with Russian troops in Paris. I mean, what an idiot, along with a lot of other troops. So this might be suburban or ex-urban myth, but a bistro, it is said, and I get this from a guy who taught me Russian history, in European history, and then Soviet history at the University of Lethbridge. He's no flunky by any means. He's a pretty sharp customer. He was saying that bistro is Russian bistra, which means quick, now. And it was French troops in Parisian restaurants, kind of ordering things up. They would have been the bosses.
The Russian troops.
Russian troops, yeah. Bistro. And it Russians tend to say in an unaccented syllable at the end of a word, O as bistra. So I've forgotten exactly how it is spelled in modern day Russian, but it does mean quick. So that's one possibility. It doesn't strike me as being a French type of word, something that's derived from Latin. Having that STR in the middle of a word, like you can get structure, but then there's something recognizable like restructure before it. And I don't know. That sounds like a fairly plausible explanation. So, this guy claims that he's got this source. that indicates that, and it's been kept undercover. And Johnston didn't follow up on it when he took over and kept it. How long? 5 minutes left?
10. But I'm just going to give them a close-up of the book so that
Okay.
they know what you're talking about there.
This one comes highly recommended. It doesn't exactly explain quite as clearly as I'd like to what happened. So I can remember when I started looking at this, I talked about the conspiracy fact. Cannot get over it. Jack Ruby, just if he'd been a regular citizen, had no business being in Dallas, in the Dallas police station, on a regular day. On a day when they're holding the putative assassin of Kennedy. No one, absolutely no one would get in, much less some flunky, i.e. Jack Ruby, who had connections with the mob, the mafia. I'm going to show you something. Now, in The Ultimate Sacrifice, this book is quoted quite a few times. Scheim, Contract on America. And I believe there's a document here. Reproduced, is it in this one? Yeah, 2 pages. So these aren't pictures, these are kind of like photostats or something like that. They're not pictures, they're important. Okay, here we go. This is what the Warren Commission got, according to Scheim. I don't know why he didn't lie about it or whatever. Okay, so this looks whited out, and then there's this note here. Note that the description of Ruby's close association with Dallas Mafia boss Joseph, they might mispronounce it Civello, but it should be something like Civello. It's spelled Cirello, was blacked out. So it would have been blacked out the way they do, presumably with a black marker or something like that. See explanation earlier with Civello photo. So here's Joseph Civello. Looks kind of like a distray accountant or something like that. So what does it say? What's been blacked out? Right here. See? This is what occurs on the following page, except they've got whited out what would have been blacked out. So here we go. See those 3 paragraphs. During the time Moore was employed by Civello, they've got Cirello, and Le Monte, Italian importing company, such and such an avenue, Moore suspected that his employers, Joseph Cirello, but it's Joseph Civello, and Frank something or other, Monte, were engaged in racket activities, so that would be mafia activities, because on occasion they wouldn't allow him to open certain cartons containing cheese imported from Italy, although this was his alleged job. It was his opinion, based on this, that they might be importing narcotics. He had no additional information to substantiate this. Ruby was also a frequent visitor and associate of Cirello, presumably Civello, Joseph, and Lamonte. Frequent visitor. 2 officers, and this is important too. They don't point it out here in the book, but this is important. Charlie Sassone, white, male, American, about 40, a detective in the Dallas Police Department. And Marvin Blunt or something like that, Texas State policeman, were regular patrons at Hill's liquor store, and Moore felt that they were obviously either aware of the gambling activities if they were not actually involved. So Hill's liquor store apparently was involved in gambling activity. A policeman shouldn't be there, and if he should be on official duty and shutting the place down. Judge O'Brien, here's another one. A municipal judge in Dallas was a friend of Cirello or Civello and Lamonte, and more frequently
He had dealings with this judge. So those two paragraphs, although not really dealt with by Schein, if in detail, if at all, indicate that there was corruption in the Dallas police force and also amongst the judiciary in Dallas. So I'm just looking for some pictures that might... Oh yeah, here's the guy. He's at Dealey Plaza. Picked up by the police. He was coming, I think, out of the Daltex building. I don't have a good picture of it in this book, the Daltex building, but it's Dealey Plaza with access, better access actually to shooting Kennedy, because I don't think there was trees as much in the way, than the Dallas Book Depository where Lee Harvey Oswald was. Jim Braden, that's in quotation marks, was arrested after the Kennedy shooting for his suspicious presence in a building facing the president's motorcade. It's not facing, it's behind it, right? Claiming to be an oil man, Braden was released by police. 6 years later, however, a trace of his driver's license exposed his true identity, Eugene Hale Braden, a mafia associate with 35 arrests. But the police let lots of suspicious folks go that were there at Dealey Plaza or adjoining places. This book also touches on the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Now, in the this is all the stuff interest in Kennedy, re-interest in Kennedy, was occasioned by Pauline picking up a whitewash of the Warren Commission that was put out on film, something like a documentary. It's more like a mockumentary. They make a mockery of themselves and of the truth. But at the end of it, they're saying, oh, you know, it's not what the assassination buffs are saying, that everything went downhill in the United States.
And the so-called documentary that James is talking about is this one.
Schlockumentary.
Yeah.
So they're saying it didn't go bad, you know, because there was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, 1965. There, you know, like I think they brought in affirmative action. Johnson was actually something like a liberal, you know, despite the reputation he gets as being a cold lawyer and all that sort of stuff. And they go through all these sorts of things that were all wonderful. But, you know, it all ended in Richard Nixon. How did that happen? Robert Kennedy getting assassinated. And there's way too many unanswered questions about his assassination. Apparently he was in a mob-controlled hotel where he was celebrating his victory in the California primary in 1968. Looked as though he's going to win that election, maybe even hands down. Instead, Nixon wins it. And it's been pretty well all downhill since then. So that little shtick that they put on at the end of that movie, it's just disgusting. The more important, it was a coup when they took out Robert Kennedy, the mafia. I haven't done hardly any research on it, but it looks very suspicious, and it was a sea change. Lyndon Johnson had a bad record for going after the mob, unlike the two Kennedys, John Kennedy and his Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, would be responsible for the judicial system, federal judicial system in the United States, and